Welcome to my laboratory. Allow me to introduce you to my new invention, the Trustometer. Mia and I have worked so hard to bring you this groundbreaking new device. It will tell us the credibility or trustworthiness of a source of information. Today, we'll be taking a deep dive into evaluating sources. We'll take those red flags and green flags from our last lesson and expand on them. We'll also spend some time discussing bias in sources, how to identify it, how to prove a source is biased, and what it means for your research projects. Now that that's out of the way, let's see the Trustometer in action. I'm going to go back to my research question from the first lesson of this unit. How do social media apps affect the mental health of high school-aged teens in the US? I found a source that may help answer this question. Let's plug the details into my creation, the Trustometer. Okay, it's booted up and ready to go. First, some information about the author. Dr. Darren Smith went to Harvard to become a clinical psychologist. He has published many peer-reviewed studies about the impact of technology on human behavior. He also has worked for several big social media companies as a lobbyist, meaning he helps them advance their agenda politically. Let's look at the source itself. It was published in a major publication, and it was published recently, just a few months ago. Now, here's a big factor: the content of the article itself. Dr. Smith mostly talks about the positives of social media use in teenagers, covering just one side of the issue. The author does use pieces of evidence from other reliable sources to back up his claims. Now, let's look at our final results. According to my trusty Trustometer, this is a fairly reliable source. Well, we've seen the Trustometer in action. It's time to start our deep dive into evaluating sources. Follow along in your PDF and complete the guided notes. Before we get started with our deep dive in evaluating sources, take a moment to pause and consider. What do you think is important to look closely at when evaluating the credibility or trustworthiness of a source? There are 5 main areas to look closely at. We'll discuss 4 of them in this portion of the lesson: credibility of the author, purpose, timeliness, and accuracy. The other element to consider is potential bias, but that will get its own special deep dive a little later. Let's start with the credibility of the author. This may require you to do a tiny bit of research into the author using a search engine. Here are some factors to consider. First of all, is there an author listed? If there is no author, you can assume the author is the organization that published the source. If that's the case for any of your sources, treat the organization just like a human author when you ask yourself these questions. What makes the author an authority on this topic? For example, do they have any credentials that make them a more reliable source? What, if anything, makes this author an expert? Let's think back to the source I put in the Trustometer earlier. The author of that source was a psychologist who went to a prestigious university. He has credentials and is an expert in his field. All those characteristics about the author made the Trustometer indicate that the source was trustworthy. Oh, and it's important to note that not every reliable source is written by an expert with lots of credentials. So don't write off a source just because it's a news article written by a journalist or a study whose author you can't find much information about. The next thing we want to look at is the purpose of the source. Take a moment to pause and consider, what could the purpose of a piece of writing be? All writing has a purpose, whether it's to inform, persuade, entertain, sell a product, or advance a specific agenda. Ask yourself, what purpose does the source serve? What is the author trying to achieve? You'll also want to consider the type of website. If we think back again, the source I put through the Trustometer was written by an expert who also worked as a lobbyist for social media companies. This makes me consider that his purpose may have actually been to persuade people that social media is good for teenagers. No wonder the Trustometer didn't like that fact. The next thing is timeliness. This one is pretty self-explanatory. Was the source published or updated recently? If there are citations, are they from sources that are current or are they out of date? Information about technology changes rapidly, so you'll want to look for sources that are no more than 10 years old. I definitely remember the Trustometer liking that the source I gave it was published so recently. Then there's accuracy, probably the most important aspect of a source to evaluate. You may be thinking, how could I know if the source is accurate or not? I'm just trying to learn about this topic myself. Remember, you are always going to have multiple sources when researching. If one source sticks out as having drastically different facts than the others, that's a red flag. Is the information presented as fact or opinion? We definitely want to avoid opinion. Are claims backed up by evidence? Are there citations to other sources? And, of course, if you see anything that you know is untrue or seems really unlikely, it's probably best to skip that source. Going back to my source about social media's impact on teenagers' mental health, I remember that my source used evidence from other reliable sources, and that the Trustometer responded positively to that information. It's almost like I could have figured this all out without the Trustometer. So there you have it. The 4 criteria we want to look closely at when evaluating sources: author's credibility, purpose, timeliness, and accuracy. That's it. It's my Trustometer. I wanted to test it out again, and it definitely appears to be working. Yes. What about bias? Well, bias is definitely something we want to consider when evaluating a source for trustworthiness. Being biased means having an unfair prejudice for or against a specific person, thing, or idea. It's important to be aware that bias is not always negative. One could be biased in favor of something. It's also super important to be aware that everyone has some biases, and it's very possible to not be consciously aware of your own bias. So, how will you know if a source is biased, and how does that impact the source's trustworthiness? Let's find out. When evaluating a source, we have to think critically about the potential for bias. Take a moment to pause and think. What would let you know that a source might have the potential for bias? The author for my source lobbied for social media companies, so that means he probably has a bias toward social media. In other words, he's more likely to focus on the positive aspects of social media in his article than the problems. No wonder the Trustometer didn't like that. Now, consider the purpose of the source. A source that's intended to persuade or sell a product is more likely to have a bias than one that's primary purpose is to inform or educate the public. We also want to consider the author of the source. Is it a company or organization that has a specific agenda they want to advance? That's more likely to be biased as well. If the author is a person, consider their background. Take a moment to pause and consider, what are some red flags that indicate bias that could be found in the writing of a source? Let's go over some red flags now. Arguments and claims that are very one-sided and clearly favor a particular viewpoint can be a sign of bias. Since that article from the beginning of the video focused on the positive side of social media use, it is definitely a sign of bias. Another thing to look for is sources with an extremely positive or negative view of a topic. These sources may also use strong language that is intended to make the reader feel a certain way. It's easy to manipulate people through their emotions, so this is definitely a red flag. The last thing to look out for relates back to the accuracy of the information. Are there outlandish claims? Does the source include information that you know or suspect to be untrue? Does it lack common sense? Those are all signs of bias in sources of information. I mentioned earlier that everyone has biases. Bias is everywhere. And you may be thinking, does that mean I can't use any sources that might be biased? Say you notice some potential for bias in a source, but the information itself seems good and accurate. It's probably fine to use. Just keep in mind that the biased source may be leaving out key information. That's why it's so important to have multiple sources. As long as you provide both sides of the argument and cover the topic thoroughly, you're in the clear. That just about wraps this lesson up, but I feel like you may be wondering why you can't just use my Trustometer to evaluate your sources. So let me let you in on a secret. The Trustometer is powered by my brain. So as long as I'm thinking critically, it works. That means you actually already have a built-in Trustometer. Just think critically about the information you come across, and you'll do just fine on your own. For the next 2 days, you will practice these skills and complete your own deep dive into evaluating your sources using the Source Evaluation Checklist in your PDF packet. In our next lesson, we'll learn about synthesizing our sources. We'll be right here with you every step of the way. Right on. Hey.